Every sacred tradition that has ever mapped the structure of divine reality, Egyptian, Sumerian, Kabbalistic, Hermetic, Vedic, assigned to the number 7 the same function, the completion of a terrestrial cycle, and the moment of access to what lies beyond it, not the beginning, not the midpoint, the completion, the threshold. The 7th position in any sacred sequence was not where you stopped, it was where the boundary dissolved. And embedded in the 5th chapter of Genesis, in a genealogy that most readers scan past on their way to the flood narrative, sits a number that the ancient world would have recognized immediately as a coordinate. Enoch, the 7th from Adam, right there, hiding in plain sight. The genealogy in Genesis 5 reads like a list. Adam begat Seth, Seth begat Enosh, Enosh begat Kenan, Kenan begat Mahalalel, Mahalalel begat Jared, Jared begat Enoch. 7 generations. For a modern reader, the list is administrative, births and deaths and lifespans measured in centuries. But for any reader schooled in the sacred numerological traditions that preceded and surrounded the writing of these texts, that list was not administrative. It was a map, and the 7th name on the map was marked, not by anything the text says, by what every ancient cosmological system already understood about that position. Why does the position of a person in a genealogy carry any significance at all? The question sounds like a question about ancient superstition. It is actually a question about architecture. The writers of sacred texts in the ancient world did not count carelessly. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest documents in human possession, predating Genesis in its written form, lists antediluvian kings in precise numerical order. The arrangement is not chronological convenience. The numbers carry structural meaning that the ancient audience understood the way a modern audience understands what a dollar sign means before a number. Before we go any further, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep building on this work together. The structural problem the Church has had with Enoch was never primarily theological, it was positional. The fallen watchers in the Book of Enoch descend. They come down. They move in the direction of increasing matter, increasing corruption, increasing distance from the divine source. And Enoch, the 7th, moves in the opposite direction entirely. While the watchers fall, he is taken, not simply because he was holy by moral standard, because he stood at the position in the human sequence where the movement reversal was possible, the 7th position, where the terrestrial circuit completes and the return becomes available. Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran Cave 4, multiple manuscripts, more fragments of Enochic literature recovered than fragments of almost any other text at that site. 4 separate Aramaic manuscripts of 1 Enoch, a text called the Book of Giants. The community that preserved these materials treated them as foundational, and yet the Book of Enoch is absent from the standard biblical canon. The manuscripts survived underground for 2,000 years. The exclusion was deliberate. The exclusion of the Book of Enoch from the biblical canon is a documented historical event, not a theory. The Council of Laodicea in 363 AD was one of the formal moments in the canonical consolidation process. Texts were evaluated, authorities were assigned, and the Book of Enoch, which had been widely circulated, widely cited, and foundational to the Second Temple Jewish tradition that produced Christianity, was set aside. The standard historical explanation is canonical authority. The text lacked apostolic provenance. But that explanation doesn't answer the prior question, which is why a text that's central needed to be set aside at all. What specific problem did it create? The Sumerian king list describes 7 antediluvian kings who ruled before the Great Flood. The 7th of them is Enmeduranki of Sippar. His story, preserved in Akkadian cuneiform texts, describes something precise. He was summoned to the assembly of the gods. He was shown the tablet of the gods and the cedar stylus, instruments of divine record. He was given the knowledge of oil divination and the secrets of heaven and earth. And then he was returned to teach humanity what he had been given. The seventh king, taken to the divine assembly, given the secrets, returned as a teacher. The parallel to Enoch is not a loose resemblance, it is structurally exact, and scholars working in comparative Sumerology and biblical studies have noted it in peer-reviewed literature. If something in this is opening a new layer of what you thought you knew, write in the comments, "I walked with the seventh," not as metaphor, as position. Enmeduranki was not a peripheral figure in the Sumerian tradition. Sippar was one of the great religious centers of ancient Mesopotamia, a city associated with Shamash, the sun god, the deity of divine light and cosmic order. The seventh king was the king of the city of light, given access to divine record-keeping instruments, taught the mechanism by which the invisible becomes visible, and returned to transmit. The Sumerian tradition had a specific theological framework for why this happened at the seventh position. The seven antediluvian cities, the seven antediluvian sages, the seven stages of the descent of Inanna into the underworld. 7 was the operative structural number in Sumerian cosmology. The seventh was always the threshold position. Was the author of Genesis 5 aware of the Sumerian tradition? The question carries weight, and the evidence is substantial. The flood narrative in Genesis shares enough structural detail with the Epic of Gilgamesh, itself an heir to older Sumerian flood accounts, that scholars date the textual relationship confidently. If one account was in active dialogue with Sumerian tradition, the placement of Enoch at the seventh position was not independently arrived at. It was a direct signal to an audience that shared the cosmological framework. This man is the Sumerian seventh. Watch what happens to him. 7 in the Egyptian cosmological system was the number of divine cycle completion. The 7 Hathors, the divine midwives who attended birth and determined fate. The 7 souls, which Egyptian metaphysical anatomy divided the human being into. The 7 celestial arches through which the soul passed in the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, between death and the field of reeds. 7 was not simply a large number in Egyptian sacred mathematics. It was the operational number for the complete expression of a divine cycle within the material world. When the cycle reached 7, something was complete. Something could move. 7 gates, 7 passwords, 7 challenges, 7 weights placed against the feather of Ma'at. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not organized arbitrarily. Its architecture maps a journey through 7 stages because 7 was understood as the complete terrestrial circuit, the full expression of what a soul moving through the material world needed to traverse before it could access what lay beyond the boundary of ordinary death. In the Pythagorean tradition, which the ancient sources consistently describe as having inherited its numerical theology from Egypt through direct initiation, Pythagoras himself was said to have studied in Egyptian temples. The number 7 was called the virgin number. The mathematical reasoning was precise. 7 cannot be produced by multiplying any 2 numbers within the decad that are greater than 1. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 4 is 8. 7 stands alone. It cannot be generated by the standard operations within its range. In Pythagorean sacred mathematics, this was not a numerical curiosity, it was a structural marker. 7 was the number that stood apart from the generative chain, the number that could not be produced by ordinary combination, the number of divine isolation. If this content is speaking to you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this content at the right moment. The Kabbalistic tradition built its entire cosmological framework around a structure that places 7 at its operational center. The Tree of Life contains 10 Sephirot, 10 divine attributes through which the infinite expresses itself in the created world. Of these 10, the lower 7 are the ones that map directly to the material and emotional dimensions of human experience. 7 Sephirot, between the infinite and the fully manifest. And the 7th of the lower 7, the Sephirah called Malkut, meaning kingdom, is the point where the divine finally touches matter completely, where the invisible becomes fully manifest, where the upper pattern lands in the lower world. The 7th is not the end of the journey upward. It is the point of full materialization going down, and therefore the departure point for the return going up. 5 independent traditions: Sumerian, Egyptian, Pythagorean, Kabbalistic. Vedic, where the 7 chakras map the same spectrum from earth to divine consciousness, with the 7th at the crown not as an end point, but as the access point to the universal field. 5 cosmological systems developed across different continents and different millennia. All of them assign to the number 7 the same structural function: the completion of the material circuit, the position of threshold, the point at which the pattern is whole enough to reverse direction. When 5 independent cartographers produce the same map, the argument that it is cultural coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. What they were all mapping was a structural reality, and they were all mapping the same one. The Hermetic tradition gives this structure its most explicit articulation. The 7 Hermetic principles correspond to the 7 planetary spheres through which the soul descends into material existence. This is not metaphor in the Hermetic framework. It is a literal description of cosmological mechanics. The soul acquires material attachments at each sphere on the way down. Saturn gives contraction. Jupiter gives ambition. Mars gives aggression. The Sun gives self-consciousness. Venus gives desire. Mercury gives analytical mind. The Moon gives biological instinct. 7 spheres, 7 layers of the material wrapping around the divine core. And Enoch, the 7th from Adam, is the human being in whom all 7 layers have been fully expressed in the terrestrial genealogy, not his personal experience of 7 spheres, the family line itself, moving through 7 generations, expressing the complete 7-sphere pattern in sequential human form. The Vedic tradition places the crown chakra, Sahasrara, at the 7th position not because of arbitrary numbering, but because the 7 chakras map the same sequence the Hermetic tradition maps to the 7 planetary spheres. Root to Earth, 7 to cosmic consciousness. The 7-circuit map of consciousness, moving from densest matter to divine source, appears in the Vedic tradition, the Hermetic tradition, the Egyptian tradition, the Kabbalistic tradition, and the Sumerian king count. 5 independent systems producing the same structural description. Enoch stood at the end of a 7-generation terrestrial sequence. In every one of these frameworks, that position is where the circuit completes, where translation becomes available. 5 maps, 5 independent cartographies, 1 territory, and a man named Enoch stood exactly there at the 7th position of a divine sequence. His name, in Hebrew, means initiated, dedicated. The etymology of Enoch is not incidental. The name itself carries the teaching. The 7th is the initiated one, the one who has been dedicated, set apart, for what the position enables. The name and the position say the same thing. That kind of redundancy in sacred texts is never accidental. What does the Book of Enoch actually say? The full text, not the 3-word summary that most study Bible footnotes provide. Because the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopic as 1 Enoch, in Slavonic as 2 Enoch, and in Aramaic fragments at Qumran, is not a brief document. It runs to over 100 chapters in its longest form. It describes, with consistent technical specificity, the architecture of the heavens, the functions of specific angelic classes, the mechanics of cosmic judgment, the structure of divine record-keeping, and the transmission of specific forms of knowledge from the divine level to the human level. It opens with a declaration: "This is the vision of the Holy One, given to Enoch the son of Jared, who was before the flood," not parable, not allegory, vision, given, direct transmission. If you've been searching for a deeper layer beneath the surface level, something that gives the ancient texts their structural integrity and shows how they connect, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to go further than the summary. The Book of the Watchers, the oldest identifiable section of 1 Enoch, describes 200 watchers who descend onto Mount Hermon. They are not neutral descenders. They teach humanity specific things: metalworking, cosmetics, enchantments, root-cutting, astrology, and, the text is explicit here, the eternal secrets that were preserved in heaven. The Watchers taught humanity divine technology in unauthorized form. They brought down what was not meant to be given at that stage of human development, and the result was the Nephilim, the giants born of the union between Watchers and human women. The text is specific about what was transmitted, why it was a problem, and what the divine response was. The Church's discomfort with this text was not about the morality of angelic relationships. It was about the explicit claim that divine knowledge had been transmitted to humanity outside of any institutional channel. The inversion that most readings of Enoch miss is directional. The Watchers descend. They move downward into increasing materiality, increasing violation of the boundary between the divine and the human, increasing corruption of what the text calls the original pattern. Enoch moves in the opposite direction. While the Watchers fall, he is taken upward. While they transmit divine knowledge downward in unauthorized form, he is brought directly into the divine presence. The 7th position in the human genealogy was the point at which the direction could reverse, not because Enoch was simply more virtuous by moral calculation, because the 7-circuit terrestrial pattern was complete in him, and the completion of the pattern enabled the reversal of direction. This is structural logic, not moral reward. The Hermetic tradition maps this directional logic explicitly. In the Hermetic cosmological framework, the 7 planetary spheres are not neutral transit points. They are sites of attachment. The soul acquires material identity at each sphere on the way down, and must shed that identity on each sphere on the way back up. The return requires moving through all 7 in reverse. The initiate who completes the 7-circuit terrestrial pattern has not escaped the material world. They have traversed it fully enough that the return direction becomes available. Enoch's translation is the mythic expression of what the Hermetic and Mystery School traditions called the conscious return, the movement back through the spheres that becomes possible only after the complete terrestrial circuit has been run. Genesis 5:24. One of the most anomalous verses in all of Hebrew scripture. 14 other patriarchs in the surrounding genealogy all reach the same conclusion. And he died. The formula is precise and repeated. Born, fathered sons and daughters, lived for a stated number of years and died, every single one. And then Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The construction breaks the established pattern at the 7th position, and only at the 7th position. The break is structural. The text is not saying Enoch was exceptional. It is saying that at the 7th position in the sequence, the outcome changes. The pattern itself produces a different result. The Hebrew word translated as took in Genesis 5:24 is lakach. The lexical range of this word is precise: to take, to receive, to fetch, to seize. It is used in an ordinary sense for picking up objects and in an elevated sense for divine action. Critically, the same root appears in 2 Kings 2:3, when Elijah is translated, "The Lord will take away your master from over you, and the same structural vocabulary appears in the Sumerian tradition for the divine taking of the seventh king. Enmeduranki was summoned to the divine assembly. The linguistic correspondence across Hebrew and Sumerian for the same event, the divine taking of the seventh, is precise enough that scholars working in comparative Semitic languages have treated the correspondence as evidence of shared cosmological tradition rather than coincidence. The question that the cosmological framework presses on is why the seventh generation specifically would produce a man who does not die. The answer across traditions is consistent. Because by the seventh generation, something in the human lineage had completed a full cycle of the original divine template's expression in material form. 7 generations is a complete terrestrial circuit. The seventh represents the position at which the whole pattern can be seen whole, not one expression of the pattern, not 2 or 3, but the complete 7-stage expression. At that position, the pattern recognizes itself, and what can recognize the full pattern can move in the direction of the source of the pattern. Enoch didn't escape death by being exceptional. The circuit produced the possibility. The Book of Jubilees, preserved primarily in Ethiopic and referenced in fragmentary form at Qumran, adds a specific detail to Enoch's story that changes the spatial understanding of what taken by God means. Enoch was placed in the Garden of Eden, not in heaven in the abstract sense that later theological imagination filled in. In the Garden of Eden specifically, the location where the original divine template for human existence was maintained in its undistorted form. He was taken to the source. After 7 generations of that template moving through human lineage, the 7th generation was returned to the origin point. The circuit completed by returning to where it began. This is not a symbolic reading of the text. The Book of Jubilees states it as a geographical fact. For any ancient reader who possessed the 7-circuit cosmological framework, and in the Second Temple period, that framework was not esoteric, but widespread across the Jewish world that produced the New Testament. The Book of Jubilees detail would have resolved any ambiguity. 7 generations out from the origin. The 7th returns to the origin. The circuit is the teaching. The garden is not the reward for the 7th generation. It is the proof that the circuit functions as the cosmological map describes. You complete the 7-stage pattern in the material world, and the material world releases its hold. You return to the source from which the pattern was generated. Enoch was not an exception to the human condition. He was the demonstration that the circuit was real. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a text that almost nobody outside of academic Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship has heard of. It is called the Book of Giants. Preserved in multiple Aramaic fragments across several Qumran caves, the Book of Giants describes events that occur after the Watchers fall and the Nephilim are born. The Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers and human women, begin to experience visions and dreams of destruction. They are terrified by what they see. They send 2 messengers to find Enoch, who at this point in the story is still living on earth, to interpret their dreams and to intercede on their behalf with the divine. Even the offspring of fallen angelic beings recognized Enoch as the operative point of contact with the divine, not because of his personal holiness in isolation, because of structural position. He was the 7th. He was the one the circuit had completed through. He was the transmission point. The standard academic interpretation of all of this is that the Enoch tradition was a literary convention, a way of appropriating the prestige of the Sumerian 7th king tradition into the Hebrew genealogical narrative. And the texts that grew up around Enoch were the product of Second Temple Jewish scribal creativity rather than transmission of actual ancient cosmological knowledge. This interpretation has a surface coherence, But it cannot explain the cross-traditional consistency without proposing that every tradition in the ancient world was borrowing from every other tradition simultaneously, arriving at the same structural assignment for the number 7 through a process of mutual literary influence so complete that it left no traceable seams. The convergence is too structurally precise to be adequately explained by literary borrowing alone. What the 5 traditions were preserving was a map of something real. The manuscript evidence from Qumran makes the exclusion of Enoch from the canon more anomalous, not less, the more closely you examine it. The scholars who catalogued the Dead Sea Scrolls identified fragments from at least 4 separate Aramaic manuscripts of one Enoch, designated 4Q201, 4Q202, 4Q204, and 4Q206. Additional fragments from the astronomical Book of Enoch appear in 4Q208 through 4Q211. The Book of Giants, also Enochic, was found in multiple copies. The community at Qumran that produced and preserved these manuscripts is the same community from which the intellectual and theological tradition of early Christianity emerged in significant measure. The text was not marginal to early Jewish religious life. It was central to the community that laid a major part of the groundwork for the New Testament world. Here is the historical record, stated plainly. The Book of Enoch was widely known, widely circulated, and widely cited during the Second Temple period, roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE. It influenced the Dead Sea Scrolls community. It influenced early Christian writers. Specific images, specific theological concepts, specific language constructions in the New Testament carry the imprint of Enochic literature in ways that text scholars can trace through comparative analysis. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, explicitly defended the Book of Enoch as scripture. Origen knew it. Clement of Alexandria cited it. The text was in active theological circulation in the communities that were simultaneously shaping the Christian canon, and then it was not in the canon. Why would a text that established, widely cited, and theologically influential be systematically excluded from the canonical process? The standard answer, canonical authority, apostolic provenance, doesn't close the question. It opens it. The canonical process was not a neutral evaluation of literary merit. It was a political process conducted by emerging institutional Christianity in the context of competing theological factions, state pressure, and the consolidation of religious authority. The decisions made about which texts carried authority were decisions about which frameworks for accessing the divine would be authorized, and the framework for accessing the divine that the Book of Enoch describes had a structural incompatibility with the framework that institutional Christianity was building. Enoch went directly, no priest, no sacrifice, no institutional mediation of any kind, no sacrament, no authorized clergy standing between the human and the divine. He walked with God and was taken. The text describes divine access as a function of structural position, the completion of the 7-circuit pattern, not as a function of institutional authorization. For any structure building its authority on the claim to mediate access to the divine, this is not a peripheral theological inconvenience. It is a foundational challenge. If the 7th position in a divine sequence can produce direct divine access through structural completion rather than institutional permission, then the institution is not necessary for the central function it claims to perform. Origen read the Book of Enoch and engaged with it seriously. Tertullian argued for its scriptural authority on the logic that a man holy enough to be taken by God was certainly capable of producing scripture, but Jerome, whose Latin Vulgate translation became the standard Bible of Western Christianity, rejected it. The debate between these early Christian scholars was not primarily about textual authenticity in the modern historical critical sense. It was about what model of divine access the authoritative scriptures would encode. Tertullian's position said, the structural reality described in Enoch is real, and its reality is demonstrated by Enoch's translation. Jerome's position, functionally, was that the institutional church was the authorized channel for divine access, and a text that described an alternative channel was therefore not authoritative scripture. The institutional position won the canonical process. The cosmological map was set aside. Now, Jude 1:14, one verse, sitting in a canonical text that every major branch of Christianity accepts as authoritative. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. The author of Jude is making a theological argument. He needs prophetic authority for the argument he is constructing. He reaches not for Moses, not for Isaiah, not for David. He reaches for Enoch, an apocryphal figure, a man whose book was in the process of being excluded from the canon that would include Jude's own letter. And when Jude identifies him, the identification is not by lineage, not by relationship to God, not by any holiness attribute. It is by number, the seventh from Adam. The position is the credential. Why does this matter? Because the New Testament canon contains the epistle that quotes Enoch, while excluding the book that Enoch wrote. Jude's argument depends on Enoch's authority. The canonical process said, Jude's letter is authoritative, Enoch's book is not. But Jude's authority in the specific verse rests entirely on Enoch's authority. You cannot logically accept the citation while rejecting the source without creating a structural inconsistency in the canonical argument itself. The scholars who produced the canonical decisions were aware of this tension, which makes the decision to accept Jude while excluding Enoch not a neutral oversight, but an active choice to preserve the credential while suppressing the mechanism. The only direct citation of Enoch as a prophetic authority in the entire New Testament. One citation, and it identifies him by position. Seventh from Adam, not Enoch the holy man, not Enoch the righteous, not Enoch who pleased God. Seventh from Adam. The author of Jude understood that the position was the argument, that the seven-circuit cosmological framework was the basis of Enoch's authority to prophesy, that removing his position from the identification would remove the structural logic of the citation entirely. Jude kept the position because the position was the credential, and the credential was real. What Jude preserved by naming the position is something that the canonical exclusion of the Book of Enoch could not erase. The position is the argument. 7. The number that every ancient cosmological tradition in the world that was in active dialogue with this text had already assigned to the threshold of divine access. Jude's citation is a crack in the wall of canonical suppression, a canonical text preserving in the act of citation the very cosmological framework that the canonical process was simultaneously working to set aside. The institution kept the credential and buried the manual, but the credential points directly back to the manual. It always did. The Hermetic tradition, which in its formalized expression through the Corpus Hermeticum and the Kybalion describes the soul's relationship to the seven planetary spheres, gives a name to what Jude's citation preserved: structural resonance. The law of correspondence operating not just in space, but in sequence. What the position 7 represents in the celestial structure resonates downward through every system that maps the same structure, including human genealogy. Enoch's authority as a prophet in Jude's argument is not biographical, it is structural. The seventh position in the human sequence resonates with the seventh sphere in the celestial sequence, and the seventh sphere is where the soul's descent from the divine source reaches its furthest point and where the return becomes available. Jude was citing that resonance, not just a man, a position, The mystery schools of the ancient world, Pythagorean in Greece, the Egyptian temple tradition, the later Hermetic schools of Alexandria, the Jewish mystical tradition that would formalize as Kabbalah, all preserved the seven-stage initiatory structure specifically because of this cosmological assignment. Initiation was not ceremonial in the mystery school understanding. It was functional. The initiate was being walked through the seven-circuit terrestrial pattern in a compressed, guided form. 7 stages because 7 was the complete circuit. The initiation was a map-reading exercise. The initiatory system was designed to bring the initiate into direct contact with each of the 7 stages of the terrestrial pattern, so that when the pattern completed in them, the completion was conscious rather than accidental. Enoch's translation was the mythic model. The mystery schools built an institution around teaching people to replicate the circuit. The initiation didn't end at the 7th stage. This is the part the simplified versions always flatten. The Hermetic initiatory tradition was explicit. The 7th stage of the terrestrial circuit is not a destination. It is a reversal point. The initiate who completes the 7th stage has not arrived somewhere final. They have reached the position from which the return becomes a voluntary act rather than a compelled one. The soul that descended through the 7 spheres, acquiring material identity at each one, can now move through the spheres in reverse, shedding what was acquired, because it has completed the full terrestrial circuit consciously. The mystery schools called this the second death, not physical death, but the death of the material identity that had been assembled across 7 stages of descent. What comes after the second death is what the Hermetic tradition called the return to the monad, what the Egyptian tradition called the field of reeds, what the Sumerian tradition preserved in the story of the 7th king, what Genesis 5:24 records in 14 words. The man or woman who completes the 7-circuit terrestrial pattern fully, not partially, not in concept, but in lived realization, does not move through the world the way the pattern is experienced from inside its earlier stages. The ancient initiatory traditions were consistent about this across their separate vocabularies. Something changes in the quality of perception. The Pythagorean tradition described it as the awakening of the monad, the individual unit of consciousness perceiving itself as an expression of the universal principle rather than as a separate entity within it. The Hermetic tradition described it as the dissolution of the material envelope assembled during descent. The Kabbalistic tradition described it as da'at, the knowledge that is not acquired but recognized, because the pattern that knowledge maps is now complete enough to be seen whole. The Book of Enoch described it as walking with God and being taken. Different vocabularies, same transition. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalistic mysticism, compiled in 13th century Castile, though drawing on traditions that scholars date much earlier, gives Enoch a specific cosmological address. Enoch's soul is identified with the Sephirah of Yesod. Yesod, the 9th Sephirot in the full tree of life structure, is the 6th in the lower 7 Sephirot, the Sephirot that map to the material and human dimensions of existence. Yesod is called the foundation. Its function in the Kabbalistic system is transmission. It is the Sephirah through which the higher energies of the upper Sephirot are channeled into Malkut, the 7th and final Sephirot of the lower 7, where the divine becomes fully manifest in the material world. Enoch's soul in the Kabbalistic reading is not the fully manifest, it is the transmitter between the divine source and the fully manifest world. What does it mean to be the transmitter rather than the fully manifest? The Kabbalistic tradition is specific. Yesod is the position of maximum generative power in the system because it is the channel through which everything that exists in the upper pattern becomes everything that exists in the lower world. The transmitter carries the full pattern of both worlds simultaneously. It is neither purely above nor purely below, but the functional connection between them. Enoch's position in the Kabbalistic cosmological map is not the end point of the terrestrial circuit. It is the point of maximum connection, the place in the sequence where the divine pattern is transmitted through the boundary into complete material expression. The seventh generation is not where the pattern stops. It is where the pattern is complete enough to transmit without distortion. The translation of Enoch inverts completely when you hold the Kabbalistic cosmological assignment alongside the Genesis text. It is not a story of a man escaping the material world by being exceptionally holy. It is a story of a man whose position in the terrestrial sequence made him the complete transmitter of the divine pattern. And when that transmission capacity was fully realized, the boundary between the transmitter and the source dissolved. Not because the material world was escaped, because the material world was completed. The circuit ran its full course in him. The completion of the material circuit is not the negation of the material. It is its full expression, and the full expression dissolves the boundary between the expressed pattern and its source. 7 is not the number of escape. It is the number of completion that dissolves the distinction between the part and the whole. The initiates of the Qumran community, the people who preserved 4 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch and multiple copies of the Book of Giants, were not preserving a curiosity. They were preserving operational knowledge. The system of initiation that the Book of Enoch describes and that the Enochic tradition maintained was not theoretical cosmology for academic discussion. It was a practical map of how consciousness moves through the terrestrial circuit and what becomes available at the completion of that circuit. The community at Qumran understood the number 7 as structural instruction, not decoration, not poetry, not numerological mysticism in the popular sense, a description of a real sequence, a real circuit, and a real completion that Enoch had demonstrated was possible. Instruction for what? This is the question the initiatory traditions all converge on. 7 stages. But stages of what, specifically? The answer across traditions is consistent. Stages of the progressive materialization of consciousness, each stage involving a more complete identification with a particular dimension of the material pattern. The Hermetic 7 planetary spheres describe what consciousness acquires at each stage of its descent. The Kabbalistic 7 lower Sephirot describe what divine attributes express themselves through at each stage. The Vedic 7 chakras describe what energy centers are activated at each level of the material to divine spectrum. The instruction embedded in the 7-circuit map is directional. Here is the sequence by which the divine becomes the human, and here is the same sequence run in reverse by which the human returns to the divine. Enoch completed the sequence in both directions. That is what his story encodes. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never removed the Book of Enoch from its biblical canon. It remains there today. The Ethiopian Bible, the Haile Selassie Bible used in Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy, contains one Enoch as canonical scripture. The Ethiopians call him Enoch. His text is not treated as apocryphal, not relegated to appendix status, not footnoted as pseudepigraphal curiosity. It is read in liturgical context as living scripture. The Ethiopian tradition maintained the 7-stage reading of Enoch's ascent through the heavens for over 1.5 millennia. They did not preserve it because they were unaware of the Roman canonical process. They preserved it because they were not bound by it. And what survived outside the Roman canonical jurisdiction preserves the record of what was inside it before the exclusion decisions were made. Why did Enoch survive in Ethiopia when it was excluded from Western Christianity? The answer is genuinely historical rather than conspiratorial. Ethiopian Christianity developed through the Aksumite Empire in the 4th century AD, roughly contemporaneous with the early Roman canonical consolidation process, but largely independent of it. The Ethiopian Church was not present at the councils that formalized the Western canon. The theological debates that drove the exclusion of Enoch in the Latin and Greek traditions were debates the Ethiopian Church did not participate in on the institutional level. The exclusion was not universal. It was the product of a specific institutional process in a specific geographic context. Outside that context, the text continued to be treated as what it had been treated as for centuries: canonical scripture, encoding a real cosmological map. The secular academic tradition tends to resolve all of this into the category of literary development, the evolution of mythological narrative across cultures, the borrowing and adaptation of cosmological imagery, the social function of sacred texts in maintaining community identity. This interpretive framework is useful for describing certain features of the historical record. It is not sufficient to explain the structural consistency. When 5 independent traditions across 5 continents assign the same structural function to the same number over a span of several thousand years, the literary development explanation requires either extraordinary coincidence or comprehensive mutual borrowing. The extraordinary coincidence strains probability. The comprehensive mutual borrowing requires evidence of contact that, in many cases, the historical record does not support. A third possibility, that the traditions were all mapping the same structural reality, is the one that the secular framework is not equipped to evaluate, and therefore tends not to consider. The second book of Enoch, Tut Enoch, also called the Slavonic Enoch, is a separate text from verse Enoch, preserved primarily in Old Slavonic manuscripts, and probably composed in the 1st century AD in a Jewish or Jewish-Christian context. It describes Enoch's ascent through 7 heavens in detail that fully Enoch leaves more implicit. Each heaven has a specific character, specific inhabitants, specific function. The first heaven contains the rulers of the stars. The second heaven contains fallen angels held in darkness. The third heaven contains paradise and its opposite. The fourth heaven contains the sun and moon and their angels. The fifth heaven contains the Grigori, another name for the watchers. The 6th heaven contains angelic orders who oversee the affairs of the material world. The 7th heaven contains the face of God. 7 stages, 7 distinct realms. Enoch moves through all of them, receiving knowledge at each stage, and reaches the 7th, where he stands directly before the source. Not mediated, not represented, not processed through institutional authorization, directly before the face of the 7th heaven. The 7 heavens of Sikha's Enoch and the 7 planetary spheres of the Hermetic tradition describe the same cosmological structure in different terminologies. The Hermetic tradition maps the soul's descent through Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. The second Enochic tradition maps the soul's ascent through 7 realms of progressive proximity to the divine source. Both traditions describe a 7-stage architecture of consciousness between the fully material and the fully divine. Both traditions locate the threshold at the 7th position. Both traditions describe the 7th as the point of direct contact. No further intermediary, no further structure, no further stage between the position and the source. 2 vocabularies, 1 cosmological map, 1 number. The Gnostic tradition, preserved most fully in the Nag Hammadi library, discovered in 1945 in Upper Egypt, explicitly engaged with the cosmological significance of 7. The Gnostic archons, the rulers who govern the material world and keep souls from recognizing their divine origin, number 7 in most Gnostic systems. 7 archons, 7 planetary rulers. The Gnostic reading of the 7-sphere cosmology was not celebratory. The Gnostics identified the seven spheres not as stages of purposeful descent, but as obstacles to recognition of the divine. But the structural architecture is identical. 7 stages between the divine source and full material expression. The Gnostic tradition and the Hermetic tradition read the 7-circuit cosmology differently, one as obstacle, one as curriculum, but they were working from the same map. And both traditions recognized Enoch as the figure who had successfully navigated the 7-circuit structure from bottom to top. The Gnostic apocalypse of Adam and the related Sethian texts preserved in the Nag Hammadi library describe Enoch's role in transmitting divine knowledge across the boundary of the 7, which is why the Gnostic texts that were also excluded from the canonical process kept returning to the Enochic tradition as their primary antecedent. The suppression of Enoch and the suppression of Gnosticism were not separate canonical decisions. They were responses to the same structural problem, texts describing a 7-circuit mechanism of direct divine access that does not require institutional mediation. The number 7 runs through the sacred architecture of every tradition that has ever attempted to map the relationship between consciousness and the divine, because it describes something structural about how that relationship actually works. 5 independent cosmological systems, Sumerian, Egyptian, Pythagorean, Kabbalistic, Vedic, assigned the same function to the same number. 7 stages between the individual soul and the divine source. 7 as the completion of the terrestrial circuit. 7 as the threshold. This is not cultural coincidence that accumulated across millennia through literary borrowing. This is cartography. 5 groups of ancient cartographers mapping the same territory from different positions produce the same map. The number 7 is the convergence point. Enoch stood at that convergence point in human genealogical sequence, and the genealogy preserved his position with mathematical precision. The institution removed the book because a book that shows the circuit completes in 7 steps does not need the institution to manage access to the divine. Enoch walked with God. 7. Taken directly. No priestly intermediary, no authorized ritual pathway, no sacramental structure, no institutional gatekeeper between the 7th position in a divine sequence and the source of that sequence. The Book of Enoch is a complete map of a mechanism that makes institutional religious mediation structurally unnecessary for the central function that institution claims to perform. That is not a mild doctrinal inconvenience. That is the institutional threat in its most direct form. And it explains why the exclusion was so thorough. Not just canonical exclusion, but the active suppression of a tradition that had been central to the religious life of the communities from which Christianity itself emerged. The map survived. Dead Sea Scrolls, Ethiopian canon, Slavonic manuscripts in Eastern European Christian libraries, Aramaic fragments in multiple Qumran caves, the Book of Giants, 2nd Enoch describing the 7 heavens in technical detail. The map did not survive despite the suppression. It survived through it, carried in traditions that the suppression could not reach. The Ethiopian Church read it liturgically for 1,500 years. The Slavonic tradition preserved it in manuscript form. The Qumran documents kept it in multiple copies in multiple caves. The map was never fully buried because it was never held by only one location, only one tradition, only one community. It was distributed. It survived, distributed. And in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd near Qumran found a cave, and the jars inside the cave contained what the institution had tried to remove from the accessible record. What does it mean that this information reached you today? The question is not rhetorical decoration. The initiatory traditions, all 5 of the traditions that preserved the 7-circuit cosmological map, taught that the timing of when knowledge finds a student is not random. The Hermetic tradition described this through the law of cause and effect. There are no accidents in a universe governed by law. The Kabbalistic tradition described it as the soul drawing to itself at the appropriate stage of its development, the knowledge that corresponds to where it is in the seven-circuit pattern. The Vedic tradition described it as the unfolding of karma, the soul encountering, in its progression through the circuit, exactly the teachings its current position makes available to it. The ancient teachers were consistent. The information reaches the student when the student is positioned to receive it. You are somewhere in the seven-circuit pattern. This found you because your position made it available. The ancient teachers who preserved the Enochic tradition across different forms and different locations were not preserving it as historical record. They were preserving it as operational knowledge. Because the circuit described in the seven-stage map is not a description of Enoch's unique exception. It is the description of the structure that every human consciousness moves through in its terrestrial passage. Enoch was the seventh from Adam. The number was not a limit on who could complete the circuit. It was a demonstration that the circuit could be completed, that the seven-stage pattern expressed across a human life, or a human lineage, reaches a point where the boundary between the material expression and the divine source dissolves. Enoch was not the only one who could walk this path. He was the first one to demonstrate that it was walkable, the first proof of concept. That is what the institution was afraid of, not Enoch, the proof. The paradox at the center of the seventh position is this: it is not the escape from the material world. It is the most complete expression of the material world possible, so complete that the distinction between the material expression and its divine source becomes indistinguishable. You do not reach the seventh by running from the world. You reach it by moving through the world so fully, so completely, so without evasion of any of its seven-circuit stages, that there is nothing left unresolved between you and what generated you. Enoch walked with God. The Hebrew construction is a description of sustained, unbroken orientation, not a single event of divine encounter, but a continuous state of alignment between his movement through the material world and the movement of the divine pattern that generated it. 7 generations of that pattern, completing through his lineage, 7 stages of the terrestrial circuit expressed. The completion was not sudden. It was the culmination of everything that came before it. And when the culmination arrived, the text says simply, he was not. Because at the 7th position, the distinction between being here and being there dissolves. The map was always pointing to this. Every tradition that preserved the map was pointing to this. And Jude, writing in a canonical text that would survive when Enoch's book was excluded, pointed to it one more time in the only way the canonical process could not entirely erase. 7th from Adam. The credential is the position is the teaching, and the teaching was never fully buried. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I carry the 7th. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.